I want to welcome everybody to this webinar. We're really pleased to have so many people attend. My name is Amie Bishop. I'm Outright's Senior Research Advisor and also a Global Health and Human Rights Consultant based here in Seattle, Washington in the US. This webinar is part of an ongoing series of webinars called Out Talks. And we hope you'll attend future events as well as we celebrate our 30th anniversary. In fact, November is our anniversary month, so we're going to be convening a number of special ways to celebrate. Our website has the schedule of all the information about Out Talks and also about Out Summit, which is our annual conference, which occurs in December. So you can get all that information on our website. So let's turn to the topic at hand. In May, as many of you are aware, we outright released a report called Vulnerability Amplified, the Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on LGBTIQ People. This report drew on 59 interviews with LGBTIQ people from 38 countries. And although we were still really very early in the pandemic in those days, we knew that it would hit our communities hard, that it would highlight and exacerbate pre-existing disparities in economic and food security, healthcare access, exposure to isolation, violence and scapegoating, and access to humanitarian relief and social protection. And indeed, that's exactly what our report found, that our communities were disproportionately struggling, especially due to the economic fallout stemming from pandemic containment measures. And that's, in fact, we also found that the pandemic was posing an existential threat to local and national movements for LGBTIQ human rights around the world. It's also been interesting to see that subsequent national, regional, and global reports have corroborated our findings. Most recently in one by the UN independent expert on the prevention of discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which was published about 2 months ago. So what have we done in the subsequent months with the information that we gathered? Certainly, we've been advocating for more inclusive pandemic responses in various health and humanitarian assistance spaces. We know from past crises and emergencies, and unfortunately now from this one, that we're often excluded from critical interventions and protections. But we also knew that many of our communities around the world couldn't wait for help. So we launched a COVID-19 emergency fund, which you're going to hear more about shortly. So today, how are our communities faring? How are we coping around the world 6 months into the pandemic? I'm really pleased to be joined by Outright Senior Advisor for Global Advocacy, Paul Janssen, and by 4 activists, another who's also a member of Outright, who will each provide an update on the state of their communities. I'm going to introduce them now, so panelists, please wave when I say your name. So first from Brazil, I would like to welcome Ana Tuli Araujo, who's the founder and executive director of the Libertarian Union of Trans People and Travestis, also called ULTRA. From Ghana, please welcome Davis Makayala, who is the founder of the Interfaith Diversity Network of West Africa. From Serbia, we have Jelena Vasiljevic from the Equal Rights Association for the Western Balkans, Turkey, and Serbia. Jelena, are you there? And from Jamaica, I'm pleased to introduce our very own Nish McLean, who is Outright's Caribbean Program Officer and co-founder of TransWave Jamaica. Nish was also involved in conducting a number of the interviews in his region for our May report. So before I turn to our panelists, I just want to note that for questions and answers, please use the Q&A function. Feel free to post along the way, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. We're hoping to have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So at this point, I would like to give the Zoom floor, if that's a real thing, to Paul Janssen, who will provide an update on Outright's COVID-19 emergency fund, to which I know some of you out there in Zoom land have generously contributed. So Paul, we'd like to hear from you now.
Great, thanks so much, Amie. And happy to be here with you once more to talk about the COVID Emergency Fund. It has been a journey since well, 6 months, as this webinar is saying. And just to remind what the fund was all about, like when, as early as February, we heard from Asian countries that people were like COVID was going around and that governments were putting on restrictions that had an impact on LGBTIQ organizing and organizations, and first and foremost on LGBTIQ people. Over the weeks in February and March, we got more and more of these messages. And when in half March, the total lockdown happened in many, many countries, we were overwhelmed with requests for support because people were from one day to another cut off of livelihoods, of shelters, of support, of medicines, of, well, so many things that people need in their daily lives. So Outright decided to do something about it, and that was the idea and the conceptualization of the emergency fund. And what the fund does, what does a fund do, is providing emergency financial resources and like grants, money to organizations and people that really were so heavily and severely impacted by the COVID-19 health crisis. So we said we need to do something to alleviate and support those communities. We also used the fund to get more data and more documentation on what was happening in the communities throughout the world, because like everybody was so occupied with their own little thing and what was happening in COVID, that it was really difficult at that time to also shine a spotlight on other parts of the world where things were happening that were just simply not okay and putting many people in very difficult circumstances. So the fund was offering like one-time grants ranging from $2,500 to $10,000 maximum to LGBT organizations or those organizations working with and for LGBTIQ people, registered and non-registered, and outside of like the EU, UK, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, like let's say the rich countries. So we really wanted to make sure that these funds would benefit the people that needed it most. The fund was launched on the 9th of April 2020, and since then we did a lot. Next slide, please. So we opened the applications window on the 9th of April and had it open to the 30th of April. And in that time, we received 1,520 applications from 131 countries. And just to give you an idea, there were about 732 from Africa and almost 400 from Latin America. Like it was way beyond what we expected. Like, but I still see myself sitting in that room talking about this fund. And we said, well, if we get like 300 applications, oof, it will be a lot. Well, we had more than 1,500. So the need was so overwhelmingly big that we said, wow, this fund is really going to serve a purpose. And we need to make sure that we're going to do a lot with this fund. About 70% of the requests and applications came from LGBTIQ groups and 17% from trans and intersex groups, just to give you an idea on the division on that. And what were people asking for? The majority, more than half of the applications were requests for support to buy food. Food, simple food, the basic need to have food and access to food. Like we were overwhelmed with that idea, and many people wrote like, look, I had a job and from one day to the other, I can't do my job anymore. I don't have an income. How do I get food? So this was really the main thing that came out of the applications that we received, that people needed to have income to buy food, to have access to water, because their livelihoods were from one day to the other gone. 20% of the requests were related to healthcare. And you have to think like we got many requests from groups saying, well, we need to educate our people on what COVID-19 is and how to stay away from it. And we want to buy protection materials and give them out to community members so that they stay safe and will not be infected by COVID-19. That was one group. But we also got many requests from organizations saying, actually, we have many community members who have diseases and illnesses and need medicines. And they can't access them now because of the restrictions, or they can't buy them anymore because of not having an income anymore. Can we do something about that? So of course, we supported that as well, because healthcare is another basic human right and need that should be supported all the time. 9% came for requests for shelter and housing. We saw that many LGBTIQ people were put in very difficult situations with families, abusive families, and wanted to go to shelters. But many shelters were already overburdened. So we got many requests like, we want to establish an emergency shelter for people to stay, where they can stay safe and where they can at least be with peers and be safe. So that was also a part of the request that came in. And 5% of the requests were for stipends and vouchers, again, to buy different things. Like, for instance, we got many requests like, gosh, like we need to communicate with our community members, and we need like some support to buy airtime, to buy data, to make that happen. We also had requests, for example, for transportation to make sure that food, but also medicines and other necessities of the community members could be transported to them, because people were not allowed to go out of their houses. So there was a big mix of requests coming in, but this gives you a picture of what came out of the applications. So far, what we have done is we made 114 grants in 63 countries since the end of April in 4 rounds. And actually, I'm now processing the last grants of round 4. Like a big number, like we could help or gave grants to almost 115 organizations. And we gave out about almost $1 million. $1 million. Like for us, like we could never have imagined that. We raised funds almost $1.2 million. So we could really make so many grants and give some support to many, many people and organizations that needed it. The average grant amount was $7,100, and that is after 3 rounds. So I haven't had the latest round incorporated in it, but just to give you an idea. And like the majority of the average number of people served by these grants were 437 people. So like there you can see how high the need was and how much people could do with relatively small grants in our eyes. So many of these requests were like, we're going to buy staple food so that people for the coming 3 months have at least the staples of food in their families. Beans, maize, rice, you name it, like things that will last for some time. So like people did that, and we got so many reports back now saying, thank you so much, because in March, April, when everything stopped, we really had no clue how to survive and how to find alternatives to that situation that we were confronted with overnight. And actually through the support from this fund and from Outright and all our supporters and all the supporters from Outright, we bought ourselves time not to think about hunger and pay things, but like we had some food, and then we could think about strategies how to overcome this new situation. So it gave some relief for people to have a little bit of ease of mind. But of course, COVID is still there with us, and we all know that it's unlikely to go away for the next 6 months and probably even longer. So we still receive many requests from groups, and also groups that already received the grant, like, oh my gosh, is there a possibility to have another grant? So we're looking into that the situation and see if we can do something more. So more on that later, because well, new lockdowns and restrictions are being put in place everywhere again. Like throughout the world, we see governments coming like, no, numbers are going up, so we're going to close down everything. So that's where we are with the fund at the moment. I'm more than happy to take any questions later on in this program, but for sure, and really, Amie, allow me, like I so want to thank all the sponsors, supporters, and volunteers who worked with us to make this happen. Like we're a tiny organization as Outright. Like you might think we're in an office with 150 people, but we're a staff of 20. And this was like major for us to make it happen. And without the support of all the volunteers reviewing applications and all the sponsors and donors to get us the $1.2 million to give out so many grants is just phenomenal, fantastic. So thank you all so very much for that support and help. And I think I should stop there and let the beautiful panel talk. Amie, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. Yes, it was. It really was, as you said, quite a journey and quite a challenge, and also really eye-opening to see the breadth and depth of the need that was out there. And that kind of leads us then to our first set of questions with the panelists, because in fact, what our report uncovered was mirrored by the requests by the fund and vice versa. And so one of the most dominant themes that we found within our report in May was about devastation of livelihoods and rising food insecurity among so many people. And as Paul noted, more than half, 55% of the small grant requests were related to food. And this was months ago. So what we want to talk now is sort of what is the picture now? And I'd like to start with Nish, if I could. Nish, you've talked before about the specific impact of COVID-19 on LGBT people who are overrepresented in some of the tourism industry in Caribbean, which obviously is huge. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how people are coping now.
On mute. There we go. Yes, thank you so much, Amie. And I think Paul really gave us a really great grounding in terms of how what's happening across the world, and in particularly in the Caribbean. What we find is that for LGBTIQ people, like you said, Amie, there's a great percentage of people who work in the tourism industry, and that has been one of the hardest hit sectors in the Caribbean. We rely as a region heavily on visitors, particularly in the summer months, coming to the Caribbean to enjoy the beaches, to enjoy the ocean. And what we're finding is that the stay-at-home restrictions and travel restrictions have significantly impacted people's ability to return to work. As much of the region is experiencing a second wave, the inability to work means that people are unable to take care of themselves. So the devastation to livelihood is extended a little bit beyond what is seen in other industries such as banking. There are certain industries in the Caribbean that are still functional. People are still working in certain spaces. But for LGBTIQ people who depend somewhat on informal economies, the creative industry, sex work, and indeed the tourism sector, the impact continues and is even worsening. Some of the creative things that are happening, for example, in Barbados, Barbados is now offering a remote working option for tourists to come and stay in Barbados. They call it a welcome stamp visa. So these are some of the ways that they're trying to alleviate some of those challenges so that the tourism sector can start to open up a little bit more. But at the end of the day, what we're also finding is that the challenges persist, particularly for people who are not able to benefit from government funds, small loans, etc., that are offered to people in more formal industries. So it's very much a pressing concern. And as like Paul said, many of the organizations and individuals who are seeking resources are still in need of more resources to support their own livelihood and to basically pay for basic things, food. Like this is still the most pressing concern that we're seeing in the region.
Great, thank you, Nish. And I think, I mean, again, the whole issue of employment, employability, one of the things that we found in our report back in May was that trans people in particular were hard hit in terms of being able to make the necessary living. And so I want to turn to Anna, knowing that even before the pandemic, the economic well-being of trans people can often be precarious for a variety of reasons, most notably discrimination. So could you talk about what you're seeing now in Brazil?
Well, first I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's an honor being here. And I can say just the same that Nish said about the employability of LGBTI people in Brazil. By discrimination, we're mostly on the informal employability market and sex work. And Brazil was already experiencing a slow recovery from a recent economic crisis with very high employment rates for the general population, especially for young people. And our work, it reaches more young LGBTI people. So the unemployment was already a big issue before the pandemic. And for vulnerable groups, these rates were reaching alarming levels. And when the pandemic started and the social distancing policies started being applied in the whole country, and the federal districts, Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, was the first state to develop a social distance policy. The unemployment was almost immediately for trans people and LGBTI people in general. So the people who are inserted in the labor market, formal and informal, were like in a month they were unemployed. So as Paul said, the first demand received was related to the basic needs to keep living, like the rent payments they couldn't afford. And by that, we've developed an articulated work through many organizations. So a lesbian organization developed a mental health program to attend LGBTI people in risk situation. Ultra distributed more than 200 food baskets, food basic kits, and health basic kits to make the necessary hygiene to keep safe, and masks. So we did that by working with LGBTI people who are unemployed. We bought the masks from a trans person and involved many trans persons on this process. And despite these difficulties, the emergency financial aid policy developed by the government was had a minimal security for the LGBTI population in Brazil, but it was developed in 5 months. And when the government renewed, it was the half of the amount of money by the first time. So at this moment, the biggest challenge we're facing is to reinsert these people who was in the labor market and continuing the work for insertion of those who wasn't, and make the sex work anyway, sharing information to keeping to access the healthcare system.
You're on mute, Amie.
Thank you, Anna. You raised so many important points there, and certainly highlighting how communities have had to mobilize within their own communities to support each other is something that we also heard quite a bit about. Davis, I imagine that a lot of LGBTI people in Ghana also work in the informal sector, as Anna was describing. But can you tell us what's going on in Ghana and maybe in the region?
Thank you, Outright. Before I say anything, I always want to say thank you and appreciate that Outright has to initiate this emergency fund because from our end, without this fund, we would not have been existing today. I don't think we would have been here because as soon as the pandemic struck and all the restrictions begin to come in, everything was upside down. This was like something we never prepared for. So outright launching that emergency fund became the hope, the basic hope that we could turn to. And the flexibility, like Paul was sharing, meant that we can provide not only food, the main need was food, but at the same time, if you provide shelter for people, they still have to eat and survive the basic needs that will keep our community going. And we did our research throughout the region. We didn't find any organization that followed that emergency procedure. On later, it did happen, but at that time, it was only outright that we could turn to and look to. And there was so much need of the community that even the few or many that we can help, some were angry. For instance, instead of turning to the government, which is not giving any help, we get even people get aggressive to us within the community, thinking that we are not given enough of, and we are not the government, can only give the support, limited support that we have. So it was a huge challenge from any angle that you can look at it, and more also as we are people of faith, everybody in times of crisis also come to look at either their religious community or their faith community. So a lot of people were looking up to us within the LGBTI community than we can manage or than we can handle. But we did scale through, we did make a difference from what how Outright was able to support us. So people would need food, got food. People would need shelter, got shelter. People would need transport. People would need basic data to continue to do their work. We are able to have data to continue to do their work. So I think what we would say is thank you. The situation is a slightly different now from 6 months ago, but we are still feeling, I mean, we still have people who could not go back to their homes that are still staying with us. We still have about 3 people that are still staying with us, but situation have slightly changed, and we owe the great gratitude to Outright for coming to our aid when we needed help the most.
Thank you, Davis. Yeah, I mean, the needs are overwhelming, and I certainly wouldn't think that things have been solved by any stretch. And one of the other areas that we also talked about, and Anna mentioned and others have mentioned, is the issue of healthcare and access to healthcare. And so it, you know, even early in the pandemic, when we did our report, we were hearing about disruptions to care, delays in seeking care. And I know, Yelena, you have a particular perspective on this that you wanted to share.
Yeah, well, basically what happened at the beginning of the pandemic is that, I mean, health systems crashed. And when the system crashes, the first people who are dropped out are basically LGBTI people. And that actually happened regardless of the fact that if LGBT people are in gray or black economy and they lost their jobs, and with losing the jobs, they lost the possibility of seeking the healthcare in any way. But even if you have everything that is necessary, when you at the beginning of the pandemic, even now, when you go and you ask for the specific healthcare, regardless of your HIV status or in terms of trans community, for the endocrinologist, you are always you're always having some challenges and issues basically when you try to access the healthcare. In terms of why you don't need that, basically it's COVID situation, just like we will deal with you later on. We will not deal with your health challenges now. Regardless of that, we have also one specific theme that nobody seems to be noticing, at least not here on Balkan region, is that we have intersex persons which are highly invisible, and even in that invisibility, they're not they're not seeking the healthcare. The healthcare for intersex persons is completely erased.
Mm.
So basically, we are multi-level challenges are faced basically by the community, either on Balkan region, and I'm hearing it also globally. It's not just like in Balkan region.
Mhm.
It's just like access to healthcare for trans, intersex, and LGBTIQ people is just like gone, basically gone. And that affects us on various levels. I've already spoken with some organizations which have received the funds from Outright, and they're grateful for it, because they had the opportunity to provide the necessary medications to the community. And that's why, I mean, these initiatives and these funds are quite, I would say, golden for the community in terms of it's like operational grant, and people can basically assist the community that we are basically living with. And basically, I mean, it's perfect. On the other end, we are just like also hearing like questions are, is this like one-time thing? Because we are having the first wave, we are expecting the second wave, or basically in Balkan region, the third, the fourth, and etc., etc. We are expecting new waves, we are expecting the new lockdowns, we are expecting the new and more visible challenges for the LGBTI community in terms of like losing the employment, losing the healthcare opportunities, losing various status that we basically fought for the previous decade, and what basically we could expect from various. I mean, we are always expecting the good practices which are global, but on the other end, we are also seeking like what to do next. Because if we have the second lockdown, we will have the rise of like community members asking us for assistance, and we will not be able to provide it because we have no mechanisms. We don't have tools to communicate either with state, either with funds or whomever, to see how we can basically assist them in that terms. And back to the health system, we are also seeing that besides the fact that the state is not providing the health care, organizations are trying as much as they can and succeeding as much as they can in provision of the assistance, in medical assistance, basically. But what we are basically we are trying to access also the businesses to try to see what are their possibilities, especially in this time, in terms of asking for donations, trying to see what their possibilities are for opening up more towards the LGBTI community, and trying to see either to get the employment for the LGBTI community, and to see what are the possible risk in terms of second wave, third wave, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a huge question where we all go from here.
Yeah.
I'm really struck by your description of the health situation. And of course, we're talking about, in this case, physical health, but let's also talk about mental health. What we know for sure is, the kind of pressure and the isolation that the pandemic has caused for so many people who have, before the pandemic had found chosen families, had found communities where they could be themselves, and now the pandemic literally has cut them off physically from that kind of support. So I was going to ask Anna, how that isolation and how that aspect of the pandemic has been impacting the communities that you are working with in Brazil. Can you unmute, Anna?
Oh, sorry. Just a minute, because I wrote the answer, but I lost it. Well, since the election of the president Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and the conservative movement growing up in Brazil very, very fast, LGBTI community, and especially trans community in Brazil, were already living in a kind of social distance for those who that was possible, because the violence rates were increasing much fast in the past few years. So since so the social distance policies were part or were subject of a major political dispute between the federal government, specifically from the president Jair Bolsonaro and the governors in the states, because the president was against the minimum social distance policy, and the governors needed that to increase the rates, to lower the rates about the COVID transmission. So the political dispute were the political dispute was, I'm sorry.
Okay.
The political dispute made the population encourage a perception from the population that the pandemic was not so important or so dangerous, because the president made public appearances without using masks. For you knowing, he started using masks in July. So the pandemic was much lower. We have almost 100,000 people that died when he decided that it was time to start using the masks. So that made the mental health of the LGBTI population much more vulnerable in the context of the pandemic. But at the same time, there was an attempt to return the economic activities long before it could be safe. So the population, and especially LGBTI population, for the employment issues, they were most vulnerable on this context.
Mhm.
So we had a big loss of LGBTI people, of trans people in the trans community, and trans leaderships from the social movements in Brazil. And that affected not only the mental health in the personal sense, but it affected the mental health in a collective way, affecting the organizations, affecting how we could do our work, the work we were doing, that were, major important at the moment.
Yeah, and certainly what you
Wow,
described.
sounds very similar.
Yeah, Davis, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, that sounds very similar to what we experienced in Ghana. Just before the pandemic, there was an election that was a general election that was meant to happen in July. And when there is election, one of the things politicians do is to take side with religious conservatives, to blame all kinds of blame on the LGBTIQ community. And so as the pandemic came upon, politicians and religious leaders were blaming the pandemic on the LGBTIQ community. And then the election was postponed till December 2020. So as we are now beginning to approach the end of the year, the election is going to come up, and then we are beginning to hear all kinds of different voices beginning to point finger at LGBT people, and situation like this create fear and great mental violence on the LGBTIQ community, not only in Ghana, but also in Gambia. We've got reports where Muslim clerics were also blaming the pandemic on the LGBTI community, and some people were even lives were even threatened. So it sounds almost similar to what they are witnessing in Brazil.
Yeah, it's amazing, even in this kind of crisis that the world is facing, that when politics and crises mix, that it often is that our communities seem to be the ones getting thrown under the proverbial bus, as it were, as part of the discourse. Nish, let me turn to you, because I know you also had some comments that you wanted to provide on this particular issue of mental health and the impact of the pandemic.
Sure, thank you, Amie. And I think what Anna shared really sums it up in terms of the collective strain on communities. I think that's pretty much what I'm also observing and seeing as I talk to LGBTIQ people across the region. I think people were not prepared for 6 months of isolation. I think when the pandemic hit, the general sense was that this may take, maybe 2 to 3 months. But 6 months in the pandemic, I think people are now recognizing as well in the region that it's here. And that also adds another level of strain, because I think people were holding on to what little they could in the moment. And now, as LGBTQ people, especially young people, are still stuck at home with families that are not affirming to their sexual orientation or gender identity, and also compounded by the inability to sustain themselves, the economic impact of COVID on their resources, also impacting their well-being. And the other factor to take into account is the restrictions on events and inability to access safe spaces. So I think that creates a condition or circumstances where the increased isolation and the uncertainty around when normal social interaction will return has been having quite devastating impact on the mental health of our communities. Some of the major events, even thinking about when normalcy and what normalcy looks like. So major events that are affirming to LGBTIQ people in general, such as Carnival. Carnival is a major event in the Caribbean. Trinidad is well known to have a very inclusive Carnival experience. And for one of the probably the first or second time in Trinidad's history, Carnival next year already is canceled. There's a holiday coming up in Jamaica next week, and typically holidays are a time where LGBTIQ people can come together to, have an event, however small it may be, even to go to someone's house. If we're looking at LGBTIQ people not being able to either leave home or not being in a space where they have their own homes, an outdoor event is somewhere that people can go to. At this time, quarantine measures mean that public events can only take place typically, at least the holiday coming up, between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m., which means that there are limited number of hours that people can be outside. So there are huge concerns and ongoing concerns that at this moment, there is no immediate relief for these concerns, and therefore the mental health concerns for the community, unfortunately, is at this time increasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you speak, it really, the other thing that came out and it's related is this inability to come together also means that movements and organizations who are doing such important work and advocacy at the national level or regional are unable to come together as well. And so it's actually really impacting the local movements. We did also find that, and I wanted to turn to Elena to talk a little bit about the situation. I remember last time we spoke, you talked about the concern that this pandemic was going to set back the movement by years, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much still at the same point, because the organizations have been closing down rapidly because of the lack of the funds, because majority of the funds are now either turned to the I mean, advocacy still somewhat, but direct assistance, and it's directly connected to COVID-19. And some organizations are not working directly with the LGBTI community in terms of direct assistance. And basically the funds in the Balkan region are just like shifting. We already saw the shift from the Balkan region towards the Russia region, Eurasia region in general, and then to Africa. And basically, which is quite fine in terms of, I mean, empowerment, the others, other communities which need also the assistance and help. But in terms of, I mean, we shift more towards the EU funds, and considering the fact that not all LGBTI organizations have the capacities to even to access those kind of grants and either to implement those projects, basically, we still have the, I mean, plus on that, you have to bear in mind the difficult situation within the, I mean, COVID situation and pandemic, then everything is kind of shifting, and it's shifting backwards, we're not moving forwards. I mean, the only thing that we are seeing that maybe it's like few steps ahead of us is basically that we are now more digitally aware, more technologically aware. We are now more online. We're not organizing the workshops and conferences in physical space. We're not using the funds for the travel and accommodation, but now we're using it towards the platforms, towards the campaigns, towards the different activities. But also bear in mind that our governments are not so technically evolved. So basically, when you try to organize the advocacy meeting with someone from the government, you have first to have the information if the person knows how to use the Zoom platform, for instance. And basically, all this in Balkan region, you have also now we are seeing the wave of centered right government being appointed throughout the region, and you're not having the opportunity to communicate or to have the difficult conversation with the specific institutions, because either they lack the technological knowledge or the access towards the technology, either they're not interested in having the conversation online or in person, and on the other end you don't have enough staff because organizations are closing down and lowering the budget, lowering the capacities, lowering the, I mean, basically the staff. And on the other end, and then you see that it's like movement throughout the region, because grassroots organizations are now more focused on accessing the small grants towards helping and directly assisting towards the LGBTI community in terms of COVID pandemic. On the other end, you have bigger organizations, so-called, that they're accessing different kind of funds and maybe closing those little small funds routes and etc. But there's and those organizations are also lacking funds. So funds politics and program politics are shifting. The state politics is shifting, and the only thing that you're seeing basically is that LGBTI community is not getting anywhere. They're still sitting at home. They're still having the same basic needs not being met in terms of either, as we already spoke before, either food, medication, employment, access to healthcare, access to anything. And even if we have, and on that, if we add the specific measures that state are implying to, they will like have us under, which it doesn't give you the access to like freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, of your expressing yourselves. Then you're like seeing like the major issues on various levels now, not just like political levels, but also in terms of movement, regional movement and global movement. We're just like getting set back and back and back.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about really constraining basic human rights, basic rights for assembly, for meeting, for. I saw, Davis, you were nodding your head. Do you want to add something to that point?
Yes, thank you. That's really speak right to mind, because as it is, it's been so very difficult, even within the in-country, where we have to have our groups and members to engage in all forms of dialogue. The restriction and what has happened means that most of it have to now go on digital or online or on Zoom, which we don't have the capacity. We don't have the staff capacity. We don't have the resources. And so it's very challenging to do any work. Just last week, I had to go and engage with a very high profile senior Catholic Archbishop on LGBTIQ issues. And he wouldn't see me. And he was asking me, how did you manage to come here? Don't you know COVID is around? You should find a way for us to get this online. I'm saying I'm not getting anywhere trying to get you on phone or trying to get you answer email. So I need to come. And so this pandemic is creating more and more barriers. And those who don't want to engage or have dialogue with us or with the LGBTIQ community keep using the pandemic as an excuse to create all kinds of barriers. So that's why I was nodding my head. How do we, and again, we see a lot of donors that are still not flexible. They still haven't understand on how we can continue. In fact, I thought that by now, so many donors will be thinking of co-funding and developing the activists or the people doing this work in order to be able to find a way to continue doing the work on the grassroots level. But we still find those challenges that we are not there yet. You have to be digitally well sophisticated to be able to make progress. And that's one of a big challenge that is also going on here in Ghana.
Yeah, thank you, Davis. You know, I'm looking at the clock, and we have about 8 minutes. I'm going to shift a little bit because we have a couple of questions, and I think one of the both good. One from Julie Dorf that I think really is a very rich question, and what she's written is, I'm very interested in learning about creative approaches that our communities have adopted for growing food, making PPE, etc., or any other sustainability approaches during this time. Also, any success stories for inclusion in government programs addressing COVID. You all want to pick up on that question from Julie? Any of you?
I mean, I can just jump in quickly. I don't have like a fulsome response to that, but definitely I think when we're looking at sustainability, this is always something that LGBTIQ organizations really have to think about in terms of how can they generate resources outside of donor funding, particularly as Davis shared, core funding was always a concern. So particularly when we're looking at organizations and LGBTQ people in either the informal sector, the creative industries, etc. This is all because I know of quite a few people who are making PPE, etc. But I don't have like specific examples from like donors who are supporting that process at this time. But I think it's definitely space to have a conversation about flexibility of funds that Davis, you mentioned that just now too. How can we support and lift up and create space for more flexibility of funding? And I think what Outright did with the COVID response fund was to provide resources to support organizations based on their needs and specific needs that they have shared, you know, that is relevant in their circumstances.
Thanks, Nish. Others on creative approaches? Yeah.
Well, in our network, we have skilled dressmakers among us, and so what we are able to do without any donor support is to PPE. We had the max done, and we are able to share that. We could get the material locally, is cheap and affordable, and then we can make the PPE and make the max and distribute it, which is so very expensive to afford. So that's one of the success that I could say that we did on our own.
Amie, maybe I can give
another please.
Example.
Sure.
Like we also have a project in Kenya where a trans group decided to use some of the funds to buy chicken and becoming a self-sustaining like shelter house for trans people, breeding the chicken, but also selling the eggs and using it, and like have some kind of small farm. So there were a couple of these kinds of projects where communities said like, we can't be dependent on anyone else to deliver us food. Like we need to become self-sustaining in that. So there was a push in quite a couple of projects to have elements in there to become more self-sustaining in basic food production, and it's eggs and veggies and those kinds of things.
And I
yeah, go ahead.
Do no answer too. Thank you. I'm sorry, I lost my connection for 2 times now.
I know.
In Brazil, we're looking to work with non-conventional food, because through the dollar up we had here, the real, the Brazilian money, it dropped as the historic lowest. It already came. So this economic crisis that happened through the pandemic affected really bad the food market. So the prices are getting really high, and by this reason we're looking to work on nutritional education, so we can teach LGBTI people about non-conventional food and food that is found everywhere, because this economic crisis that came with the pandemic came to stay. So the issues, the challenges we already had before the pandemic, they got really big, and they get a really scarier. So this is a thinking we're having, so we can make it easier for LGBTI people without promising what we can do.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, maybe to add on to this question about inclusion and government policies on inclusion, I think we are quite disillusioned because I haven't gotten any good example of a government that had really had an eye for the issues and needs of LGBTIQ people. Actually, in the contrary, like we saw in more countries, governments and security forces targeting LGBT people's shelters under the pretext of COVID, like, oh gosh, you're now all together, so now we have all LGBT people together, and finding people or arresting people for breaking COVID restriction rules. So instead of inclusion, I would say it gave the government an excuse to do more harassment and damage to our communities.
Yeah, unfortunately. So we're just running out of time, and I actually don't, what I want to highlight here at the end is that, you all have described, and I want to thank you so much for really being so thorough in your descriptions of what's happening in each of your countries and in your communities. One of the themes is, as hard as things remain in so many domains that we've discussed, what I also am hearing is that partly because of continued exclusion, we are as communities also mobilizing ourselves and doing what we can for ourselves, which of course demonstrates, the strength that our communities have had all along. It also isn't fair in the sense that we continue to have to do it this way, and I really hope that through continued advocacy at other levels, national, regional, and international, that we will succeed in getting at least some of the big players involved in pandemic response to be more diligent in paying attention to our community's needs. But again, I really want to thank all of you, each of you, for painting such a vivid picture of what's happening. We had one quick other question about whether we'd be doing further reporting, and I think that we don't have any concrete plans at this point, although obviously it is, the COVID pandemic is now completely, I would say, sort of integrated into the work that we're doing across the board. So it's not like, oh, we've done this and we're moving on to something else now. No, that will never be the case. It's very much a part of our reality and everything that we're in that we're doing. Katie, did you want to just put up that last slide where we just wanted to leave with what people can participate in the coming weeks? So just quickly, I mentioned earlier, it's our 30th anniversary this year and in November. So we have a video that's out, which is quite wonderful. We hope that you're invited to share any memories and photos from your own movements and what 30 years of progress has meant to you and what you hope for over the next 30. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have this ongoing webinar series. The next one is on queering peace, security, and humanitarian response, actually quite related to what we've just been talking about. And that's on October 28th. Then our conference is Out Summit, December 9th through 12th. It'll be virtual, as is everything these days. And we also hope that you will tune into our Outright TV. And of course, please include Outright in our Partners in Giving Tuesday or year-end giving. We really appreciate all the support that those of you out there have given. So with that, I think we'll come to an end. Thank you again, everyone, for your attendance, your participation, and your interest and concern about this situation. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.